Today we are doing a database review. This is an idea I got from poker, where a typical way to study would be to look at the stats from the hands you've played over a large sample size, many thousands of hands, to find the big picture areas of improvement, patterns, parts of the game where you can play better, and then drill into those more specifically. So when I kind of suggested this idea on Twitter, a lot of people responded. It seemed like people were interested in the idea. So I'm going to do a series of several of these. But for today, for this first one, I just picked one person randomly from everyone who responded to my tweet to look into their stats and see how this process works. So this player's chess.com name is d1lla. This is someone who has been playing for about a year, starting out from a beginner level and is up to 1200 rapid on chess.com. So, already really good progress for 1 year. I think this around this 1200 level for a lot of people is when chess starts to get a little bit harder. Those rating points are not as easy to come by. The opponents are getting tougher. You've kind of learned a lot of the basics, and it starts to get a little trickier to take that next step. So we're going to go in and see if we can find some areas to work on. One thing that several people mentioned is, can't you just use automated tools to do this? And there are some tools. So chess.com has this insights feature, which I guess probably not a lot of people know about because it's not that easy to find on the site, but it is there and it's pretty interesting to look at. There's a lot of stats, a lot of charts you can look at, which, this is kind of cool to look through. I had kind of had trouble connecting some of this stuff to actions you can really take to improve your game, but it's definitely interesting to look at. And then there's also Aim Chess, which is a whole service that's really designed to do just this, to automatically look at your games, look at the stats, and tell you how to improve. So I found this was helpful, at least as a starting point. As we go into specific areas, there's going to be I have some thoughts from going through the games in more detail, but we'll get to that. As a starting point, I think this overview showing different areas of your game is pretty good, and right away it's calling out time management as a potential big weakness. And this is something that's often overlooked because I think people don't see time management as part of chess strategy in the same way that like tactics or pawn structure or whatever. But in terms of your competitive results, it can be hugely impactful. And if you have a big problem with time management, that can pretty much be a huge blocker for improving or increasing your rating. So if we go down to this tab, let's see, down here, there's a few different things it shows here, like outcomes when you were ahead or behind. But to me, this is the most interesting one. This is percentage of time left versus move number. And I think down here, this x-axis these are like half moves, like ply, I believe. But the point is, on average, you're playing a lot slower than your opponents. And I did notice this when I went in the games. You're often behind on the clock. So it says, according to Aim Chess, you're behind on the clock for 82% of your moves. So that's why it's flagging that as an area of weakness. So that's interesting. Although when I dug into this, I actually ended up with a little bit different take on it. So first, let me just say a little bit about how I think about time management. So I generally don't base my time management strategy on what my opponent is doing or trying to keep up with my opponent, because I think a lot of people are pretty bad at time management, honestly. So to tether my strategy to what my opponent is doing, to just try to match them, doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because then I'm just going to be copying someone who probably doesn't have such a good strategy. So I prefer to think about it in terms of using my own time as effectively as I can. And for me, the best tool to do that is to try to stay on schedule, which means to divide up my total time that I have between all the moves I'm going to have to play and divide it fairly evenly, so I have a reasonable amount of time for the whole game. So you are playing mostly 10-minute chess, which is that's pretty fast. That's right on the borderline between blitz and rapid chess. So you could might be a good idea to mix in some slower games, which you were with some 30-minute, but that's sort of a different story. Let's just look at this right. So to talk about being on schedule, what I mean is you've got 10 minutes for the whole game. So if we multiply that by 60, that's 60 seconds. 600 total seconds you have. And the average chess game lasts about 40 moves. That's just like a stat. If you look at a big sample of games, the average comes out to about 40 moves for the whole game. So that 600 seconds divided by 40 brings you out to 15 seconds per move. And you basically want to stay on roughly that schedule, because if you drop behind that, then later in the game you will run out of time and be in time pressure. So then what I did here is I just grabbed all your games for last 3 months. Chess.com actually has an API where you can just get, access anyone's games. So I pulled all your 10-minute games for the last 3 months. And what I did here with this chart is to plot so the x-axis here is move number, y-axis is time in seconds left, and the orange line would be that schedule I just talked about. So that's just exactly 15 seconds per move, starting out with 600 seconds and going, if you stay on that schedule, you would hit 0 seconds on move 40. And you can kind of checkpoint that out of like, okay, move 10, I should have at least 7.5 minutes. Move 20, I should have at least 5 minutes, and so on. And ideally, you want to be a little bit ahead of that schedule, because especially with no increment, you don't want to just flag on move 40. You might have to play a long end game. You don't want to lose on time. And additionally, the opening moves, hopefully if you have solid opening preparation, are a bit easier to play because you're already in your preparation. So you can get a little bit of a buffer there. And when I did this, so the orange line is the schedule. The blue line is your time usage as an average over all of those games, how much time you had left on average at that move number. And it actually is looking really good. You are getting a little bit ahead and developing a buffer in the opening, which is what you want to see. You're then using that extra time in the middle game, which again makes sense. The middle game is typically the most complex part of the game and often when the game is decided. So it makes sense to invest a little extra time there, but you're still staying right on schedule. And then as we get to the end game, you are playing a bit faster to allow yourself to play a longer game without flagging. So actually, I would say this looks perfect. And then what's really interesting is when I did the same thing for your opponents, they are certainly playing faster than you. That's why this blue line is higher. That means on average they have more time left. But I would say your opponents on average are really playing too fast, because if we look at 300 seconds, that's 5 minutes. That's half of the starting time of 10 minutes. So on average, on move 40, your opponents have half of their starting time still on their clock. So I would say that's actually too fast. That means they are not using the time they have available to them to play the best possible moves. So after looking at this, I kind of ended up with a different take that I think you're actually managing your time pretty well on average. And it looks to me like the average player at this rating level is really playing too fast. And one thing I will say about this is this idea of staying on schedule, not worrying about what your opponent is doing, that applies more the slower the game is. So in classical, I think that definitely makes sense. As you get into faster and faster time controls, especially like bullet, if you're talking about 1 minute chess, the majority of games are decided on the clock by flagging, not on the board. So at that point, the clock does become a real weapon, and just playing as fast as you possibly can is kind of the strategy. But once you get to certain, slower time controls, certainly classical, once you get to a point where flagging is not a likely way the game is decided, it becomes more and more about just using your own time to play good moves. And I think on average, you're actually doing a pretty good job of this. Now, having said that, it is just an average. So it could be the case that, something like in some games you're playing too slow, some games you're playing too fast, and the average ends up in the middle. So I also looked at this. I looked at this a few different ways. One other thing I looked at was moves where you took a very long time on one move. So for this, I used more than 60 seconds on one move. So that would be, to use over 1 minute in a 10-minute game is kind of a lot. And what I found here, and then I looked at those positions, and this was kind of interesting because what you would, let me just reset this. Oops. Okay. Just have to reset this window so you can actually see this board. Okay, great. Typically, for most people, when they spend a lot of time, it's when they are in trouble. But often, in your case, I found it was sort of the opposite. A lot of the moves where you spent more than 1 minute were when you had quite a good position, and I don't know this for sure, but my sense was it was positions where you felt like you should have a forcing win, but you were struggling to find it and burning a lot of time on the clock. So here's an example. You're already up a piece here. You have an extra knight, and you also have a potential discovered attack with this bishop lined up on the queen. So I imagine you're calculating moves like knight f5, knight e6, stuff like this, and trying to find a forcing win, but weren't quite making it work, which is true. There, you're winning because you're up a piece, but there's not a direct tactical knockout here. So what you could do in a position like this is just play, the move that comes to mind is just castle, getting out of this pin, getting your king to safety. I think I have another example of, right here, another position where you spent a long time, and you can see, I'm on the game here, you can see the times are to the right of the moves over here. And by the way, this is a great thing for anyone to review. When you review your games, first of all, you should review certainly all of your rapid games and slower, and even blitz games. But I think most people know that you should review your mistakes. It's also really helpful to review the moves where you spent the longest time, especially if there's a particular move where you got stuck and spent like a really long time, because that is indicative of being stuck, being uncomfortable in the position. There's something that you didn't understand or that was bothering you. So to go back into that position and get a better understanding of it can be really helpful. So here's another case where you have a great position, your opponent's king is extremely exposed, and you spent a long time. I think rook e4 is probably a decent move. It's not the computer's top move, but okay, this actually doesn't. So you're threatening to come over here, but it allows this hitting your rook and the bishop defending rook h4. But I'm less concerned with this specific move, and I'm more just thinking about the overall pattern here, which is what I was seeing is most of the times where you're spending a lot of time, you actually had a good position, and I think you were looking for a knockout. This can be a result of doing a lot of puzzles, actually, because when you do those puzzles on chess.com or any sort of tactics trainer, you're fed a constant string of positions where there is one and exactly one direct win, like a forcing win. There's a few draws mixed in and stuff, but basically it's all forcing wins. So that can kind of train you to anticipate that type of solution is available in the position. But that's not the case in the majority of chess positions you encounter in a real game. You can have positions where it's just a balanced position. There are many decent moves. None of them are winning. You can have overwhelmingly good positions where there are many winning moves. You can have all sorts of different scenarios. So if you do a ton of tactics and then you find yourself in a real game in a position where you have some forcing moves available, you've sort of been trained to expect that one of those lines will lead to a direct win. But that's not guaranteed in a real game. And so I think what I would say is you could work on your calculation being a little bit more crisp, working through those lines, those forcing lines quickly and accurately. And if none of them do lead to a win, recognizing that a bit more quickly and playing like a solid improving move, like just castle in this position. And ways you can work on that type of calculation, just difficult exercises. But another good one would be, sometimes it's called solitaire chess, sometimes it's called guess the moves. But basically you choose a game, often a master game, hide the remaining moves. You can do that with either a book or you can do it online. And you just go move by move, guessing the moves for one side. And what that gives you is, as opposed to puzzles where you're only seeing this very specific type of situation where there is a clear win, if you go through a whole game, you're actually getting training in every type of position. Okay, so that is going to wrap up time management. Overall, I would say, on average, your time management is good. There's a few moves where you're getting stuck. Perhaps looking for a forcing win when it's not there. Maybe just the calculation is not quite as crisp as you want it to be. But let's look at openings. Aim Chess is saying your openings are really strong, 90th percentile. And I would agree with that. Your openings rather seem well chosen, well practiced. If we look at this opening, this is another great tool on chess.com, the Opening Explorer. So I've got selected your username, Rapid. You're an E4 player, you're scoring 51% there. If I switch this to black, you're scoring about 45% with black. So this is very typical. There's usually like a 5-6% difference between white and black just based on white having the first move advantage. So this all looks pretty good. And my only comment about your openings would be, I think your openings are probably a little bit too good, which sounds weird. But what I mean by that is going through your games, it's clear that you have a lot of very specific preparation, lines that you seem to have memorized in your openings. And I think for your level right now, it's probably a bit of overkill. And I haven't, gone over this player's study routine, but my guess would be you're probably spending too much of your overall study time on the opening. Your openings are already really good, so that's fine. So I'd say at this point, do not spend more than like 20% maximum of your study time on opening. You can use that for playing, reviewing your games, doing more calculation training, all those sorts of things that are going to be useful in a wide variety of positions. And just to give an example of this, of why why memorizing opening lines is not like as impactful as we often think it would be. So okay, let's look at black. So I did notice one area where you are struggling a bit is against the Queen's Gambit. So here you're playing the Slav as your main response, but only scoring 27%. So if you are going to go in and work on your openings, that might be an area to target. But again, my main point is just don't spend too much time overall working on your openings. But what was interesting to me is this is just a funny game in that there's this one game where you played c5 here. And I think this was the only game where you played this. So I'm guessing it was just a mouse slip and you were intending to play the Slav, but played c5, which is an unorthodox move, but not really that bad of a move. But what's interesting is that in the game, you ended up, you just brought out your pieces and ended up winning this knight with a pin. And you just won the game very quickly with a nice game where you brought out all your pieces, took advantage of some mistakes by your opponent, and just your opponent resigned after 19 moves. So my point here is that even in this move where you made this game where you made a mouse slip, I think, on move 2, you actually ended up winning the game just with sort of opening principles. So I think this is sort of just a funny illustration of the limits of the value of opening preparation and how you can actually get good results without, almost, I don't want to say playing something random in the opening, but almost it's like these long memorized variations don't actually tend to help us win the game a lot of the time. Okay, I've got a few other thoughts. So this one was about Aim Chess is calling this resourcefulness and advantage capitalization. So the idea of playing from ahead or behind. When you're way ahead, are you converting that game into a win? When you're way behind, are you making as many comebacks as you want to? So here's an example of a game where you won a piece early on in the opening, and you ended up losing this game. So I just wanted to highlight this as a strategy because I noticed this in a few games, and I think this is very typical at this level, is that when you're ahead, like especially ahead material, like by a piece or more, what I see is a lot of players playing really aggressively in that scenario, like trying to keep the momentum going, like all out, go forward, attack. And I think maybe it's like you're scared if you give your opponent room to breathe, they'll make, I don't know, they'll make a comeback, or you'll sort of show weakness or something. But the thing is, when you're up a piece, you don't need to attack. You don't really need to do much of anything other than finish development, get all your pieces out, castle for sure, keep everything defended. And that extra piece, as long as nothing crazy happens, that extra piece will allow you to win in the long run. So in a position like this, I would definitely just castle. King safety is huge when you're up a piece, because the easiest way to lose when you're ahead in material is to get your king attacked or checkmated, because at that point your extra material becomes irrelevant. So here I would for sure castle. You took this pawn on d4, which is objectively okay, but you just understand that when you're ahead by a piece, you don't need an extra pawn really. You just need to make sure your king is safe and all your pieces get into the game. I think castle here. Yeah, it's still a good spot to castle. And then this is the problem with not castling, is then when stuff gets crazy, now it gets more difficult, because here you would love to castle still, but there's a tactic, check, and the queen drops off. So at this point, it's already getting a little bit tricky. And in the game you played knight g5, which this is already a bit of a difficult situation. The computer wants to play like king f1 to just get off the e-file. But, just an all-out attack with just two pieces is not really the right approach when you're up a piece. You want to be solid, consolidate, get all your pieces in the game. You don't really need to attack at this moment. And I noticed in some of the games where you're behind, it was sort of the opposite. You were actually playing conservative trading. So I just wanted to point that out as sort of a strategy mindset shift that I saw in your games. I see in a lot of players' games where you're playing really aggressively when you're up material and playing passively and trading when you're down material. And you actually want to completely flip that. When you're down material, that is the time where your best chance may be for a desperation attack, go for something really risky, complicate the game. And when you're up, that's actually the time where you want to play quite solid, keep things simple, trade, and just guide that, keep that extra piece, keep that extra material. And in the long run, you can win an endgame as long as you keep sort of holding everything together. And then the last thing I noticed was, in terms of strategy, just pawn play. So, you're up to the 1200 level. You are doing a pretty good job of not, taking your opponent's pieces when you can and not letting them just, not blundering your own pieces. But I noticed a lot of spots where your sort of radar for hanging pawns is a little bit less. So here's a position where black is just attacking this pawn. And, there's a lot of what knight c3 would be an obvious move. e5 is possible. Even castle you could do, because black, this would indirectly attack the, defend the pawn because of the pin. But here, after bishop e3, queen takes e4, all of a sudden, you're in a lot of trouble because all this stuff is attacked. So it's another thing I see quite often. I find like most people sort of first get a handle on not hanging pieces, and then they just become aware of pawns, which does make sense because pawns are less impactful. But certainly you don't want to give away pawns for free, and you don't want to, and if your opponent allows you to take a pawn for free, you do still want to take that. And then finally another one related to pawns that I noticed is I did notice a bit of a pattern of making a few too many weakening pawn moves, especially around your king. So here's a position where your opponent just played h6 and you play h4. I guess maybe you were anticipating that they wanted to play g5 and prevent that, but the thing is, g5 would not be a good move for black anyway. You should just play a developing move like knight d2. And then if black played g5, that would really just weaken their own position. They don't have a very credible attack on your king there, so this would just be a weakening move. So you should stick with, opening principles. Get out all the pieces. h4, on the other hand, pushing pawns, especially two squares in front of your king, is just going to be weakening your king position. And here's one more example that this actually kind of ties together the last 2 points of both playing sometimes a bit too aggressively when ahead in material and also making weakening pawn moves. So here as black, you've got an extra exchange, a really good position. There are a lot of moves you could play, but g5 here is a mistake because this really weakens your king position. At the moment, this pawn is doing a nice job of shielding your king and also blocking this knight from coming in anywhere. After g5, this pawn is going to be weak. This knight can come in, and all of a sudden, it's actually a very difficult position. White's going to get a big attack here. So, given that you're ahead of material and white is not threatening anything in particular, the computer wants to play queen d4 check and go take this pawn. You could do that, but I mean, I think even just a move like a4, rook e7, b4, there's many moves you could play, but basically you want to exercise some caution and be pretty calm here and just keep everything really solid. In the long run, you are up in exchange, so it should be a winning position if nothing too crazy happens. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. So just to review the areas we looked at, time management initially flagged as an area of concern because you're often you're often behind on the clock. Looking deeper into that, I think your time management is actually pretty solid. You're doing a good job of using the full time available to you. If anything, your opponents are playing too quickly in a lot of games. But the only adjustment I would make there is definitely review any move where you spent a large fraction of your overall time. Go back and review that. Try to understand what you were struggling with on that move. And often it probably comes down to calculation of just going through those forcing lines more crisply. And if none of them are working out, recognizing that and just playing a solid improving move. Then in terms of the opening, your openings are really good. I like the lines you're playing. They might be a little bit too good in the sense that you're probably, I think, spending more of your study time than you really should be at this point on opening review. So I'd say at this point, just minimize the time you're spending on the opening. Just maintain the opening repertoire you have and focus on other parts of the game. And then finally, watch out for those pawn moves. You're hanging pawns or taking the opponent's pawns, and really try to avoid creating pawn weaknesses around your king, especially advancing pawns 2 squares forward in front of your own king, because that is going to make it a lot easier for your opponent to attack you. So, okay, this is the first of these database reviews we've done. I'm interested what people think of this format. Hopefully it's helpful. I'm going to continue refining it, so let me know what you think.